Hi. Um, Maybe what I'll do is, in thinking about this, I think it's a little bit of an invention, imagining where the poems begin. I like to think usually that poems kind of begin in me in an image I sort of find myself troubling my mind around, or a sound of words that I do. But in fact, probably the wells of subject matter that I keep turning to have something to do with either very much the daily life as I live it, sort of looking hard and observing and witnessing the daily life, the life of mine, the life of others. And the other piece of it, I would say, is looking into the kind of mythology of family, maybe the mythology of my current family, but also the mythology of the family I derived from. So I'm going to read a couple of poems, and maybe they all kind of come out of that world. I grew up in a family where both my parents had come to a first-generation family. So both my parents had been refugees, and as were my surviving grandparents. And I grew up probably like most first-generation kids, where there's this great forward movement to be American, for that generation to be American, and yet as you become more and more American, you kind of betray the family more and more and more, the family behind you. So this is a poem maybe that speaks to that. It's a poem called Be So Kind. My sisters and I belong in the Russian story where plump dark bread is clothed and saved each night. There is the porcelain bowl one sister weeps into and washes red stockings. In the courtyard, where the other sister hangs her embroidered linens, you can smell the river Prut. I am tutored for examinations, but leave the university to nurse a trembling uncle. At night, we button our hands to silk blankets. When the betrayals begin, we paint ourselves and nest inside one another. Here we totter, unfit for your America. We kneel, fingers stuck in our throats. Please be so kind as to let the author know that if there is any choice in this matter, my sisters and I, we'd rather kill each other in our Bessarabian woods where the snow mounts indecently to the top branches. There was a period of time in my life where, a long period of time in my life where I felt that my current life was so not the matter of poetry that I couldn't imagine what I could write. And that was a troubling feeling. So I was parenting two young kids and thought, what am I going to write? The poet at the bowling alley, the poet takes her kids to McDonald's again, the poet refuses to let her kids go to McDonald's. So at a certain point, that experience was so troubling that, and I wasn't writing, and so I began to wake at night a lot. Finally, my challenge to myself was to, and meanwhile, I had been a lover of so many writers whose lives engaged the lives of children, engaged their present lives. So it was some sort of contradiction I had to work out. So I began to think that the task was to gather up inside of me the bits of the day or the bits of the week and almost throw them as if they were not my own life onto pieces of paper in front of me to construct a poem. So this is an epistolary poem that came out of that time, and it's called The Bounty. And it's a poem that's written to Jerry Stern, who had been kind enough to have selected my first book of poems. So it's partly a poem written to the person who I felt indebted to for having pulled my first book out, and now I was in the panic of trying to think I had a second book in me. So the other poet who's mentioned here is the poet Jack Gilbert, and everything else may be obvious. Dear Jerry, while you and your Pittsburgh buddy, the venerable Jack Gilbert, read to poets gathered in that same city, I was walking the aisles of Costco with Jonah and Gabriel. Have you ever been there? Or in one of those warehouse food chains, stores of the Alice Eat Me variety, everything enlarged, larger than life, at least my life, with its city cupboards, but also stores where my all-American, albeit first-generation, appetite for purchase is born, and born again in the next aisle where a forklift pulls out a crate of Dunkaroos. The boys scream for everything big. You, with grown children, what do you know from Dunkaroos? And my God, the austere Jack Gilbert, what would Gilbert think of the double-sized cart overfilled with 36 rolls of Charmin, bulk-wrapped Bounty, 12 for $8.79, and cases of juicy juice boxes, food chains with not a thing in my cart from the food chain. But you understand, Jerry, the deals, Jerry, the deals. Gilbert with his mountain and his poem Hunger that I read to students to take them to that line, going beyond the seeds. What would Gilbert think of Jonah and me filling to overflowing the oversized cart, and Gabriel piled high in the cart holding a 2.5-pound box of cheddar goldfish? Did he read the poem Hunger? Did you read your Song of the Green Willow? Or was it all new poems, and in your hometown too? I would have liked that too, to be childless in Pittsburgh among poets, even with my shyness of poets. Instead, there was enough French's mustard to squirt the boys through childhood. But the deals, Jerry and I have the receipt to prove it. That's 36 rolls of toilet paper at 24 cents a roll, and 12 for $8.79 comes to 73 cents a roll of paper towels, and so on upward to $288.57 with not a vegetable or a fruit in the cart. I remember my first time not at Costco but at BJ's, which is the same but with a different name. Jonah, maybe 2 months, woke with a raucous hunger. I nursed, sitting on stacked crates below the stocked warehouse shelves. The shoppers gave me terrible looks. I tried to write that BJ's poem but got stuck with a fake Whitman love of the things and a true highbrow hatred of glut without even a mention of Jonah's delicious suck. This time, there was also a frenzy of sucking, the kids wanting to eat and drink everything in the car, and both boys screaming, "There's nothing at all here to eat." What's left? I got lost on 95, brought Jonah late to his violin lesson, waited out front with Gabe asleep in back, and that's when I had the chance to think of Pittsburgh, of poems, of you and your friend. Imagine Jonah with his quarter-size violin. Imagine Dunkaroos, his small fingers, his wrist held just right to bow, the bounty of your music, Gilbert's strict beauty, Gabe sleeping through it, and this, my happiness, Jerry, the whole heartbreaking deal. Mm-hmm. So that poem gave me the opportunity to begin to feel like I would just really throw everything of a day on the table and begin to observe that, which is partly what the enterprise of that book, Swoon, was. And then when, in this more recent book, Women Without Umbrella, I began to think about that. One of the things that had happened, this sort of relates to the idea of paintings. I began to think at one point in that book of gesture paintings by artists where they just do a painting and a drawing and a drawing and a drawing. And I began to think about that and the different approaches to a woman and to different women, and one woman and multiple women. And so that began to be a piece of the subject matter inside of Women Without Umbrella. And so probably the other subject, aside from sort of the mythology of family and the mythology of mothering, has been the mythology of love and the struggle inside of that. So I guess that's one of the other ones to read. One of the things that became interesting to me in this book was thinking about transformations. So there are a bunch of poems in here in which I imagine Circe, more middle-aged, Persephone, more middle-aged, basically everyone middle-aged. The wolf from Little Red Riding Hood, more middle-aged. Men and women, God bless us all, just getting older and older. partly I was thinking about that in terms of love, and partly I was thinking about that in terms of mortality. So this is Circe, kind of reckoning a bit later in her life at herself. Maybe the damage she has wrought, but also the specific other. Circe. She thinks she should apologize that she still loves a man's body this much. The line of hair now mown with gray, wandering thin and messy down the sloped stomach, and his stomach, even there, just under where he's thickened, the hard ridge and jag of muscle, an old athlete's story he's telling when he pulls onto those blown-out knees, wrestling her up against his hips, which work their game, though sometimes a new, slower, easier game she didn't know to ask for back then. Though back then, he reminds her now with a quickening, worked exactly right too. So when she yanks close, grabbing the softened, thinned neck skin, she looks. Once, she took them only for their turned, lost, cloven surprise. But now this slight hanging slump of the cheek, the bluish pouch rimmed under those eyes, the effort across a man's face, this man as he yields there as he was, always, finally, that bright absolute. You know, it was as I started to write it that I began to think of Circe, which is probably, I started it as an I poem. And I don't think of myself as identified as Circe particularly, but certainly, God bless, at a certain point one has, a past that moves behind them. And, one thinks of any piece of their beginning and the ways that they have honored or not honored what could have been then. So I think as I wrote, it was the discovery of Circe, as opposed to it wasn't, I've never been a writer who's undertaken sort of, I always admire it and wish I did, undertaken kind of projects, like I'm gonna write a ton of poems in the voice of. So really all of these, Persephone, the wolf poem, well, the wolf poem came out of sound. I had given myself a kind of an assignment of limitation, and I tripped into this. I mean, there are stories that fascinate us, and I've always loved, the stories inside of the Odyssey are stories that have always fascinated. Fairy tales have always fascinated me. So I don't have to go far to find them, but I didn't go to them first. So they came up out of the work. I don't think of poetry as poetry for poetry's sake. I think it's song, I think it's story, and I think that's part of the great mystery that people hunger for. I think people hunger for acts of the imagination in whatever form of art. And certainly as a young person, I was moved by story, and I was moved by prayer, and I was moved by song. And I wasn't really, as a young person, aware of why, but I knew I moved toward it. And I grew up with a mom who was a ballet teacher, so that was the required lesson among the three girls. I was the youngest of three girls, so I grew up in a family where that was the given art form. But I think I also grew up in a family, as I said, where there were people from other countries living all around me, and languages were kind of secret inside of my house. There were a lot of languages spoken that the deal was the children were never supposed to learn. I sat in a room with my mother and grandmother speaking to each other exclusively in Russian and Romanian, and I know not a word of it, although I feel total. So I think it was the sound of that, the sound of language, the sound of the mystery of language. And I was the only one inside of my family particularly interested in books, and I dove in, and it was my claim, was this language. It was my secret language. I was fascinated with the child ballads that came out of England, and I loved them. I loved them for their rhyme. I loved them for their sort of dark narratives, and I was just into them. So they were an early influence of mine. I think Robert Frost was an early influence, but I also didn't really know you could be alive and be a poet, you know. I was writing poems, but I didn't really know it. My first experience of seeing a live poet or hearing about a live poet was my eldest sister had a boyfriend who went off to college, and she broke up with him. And he immediately sent her this box of poems he had written. And my sister, I don't even know that she read it, right? She just discarded it. She was done with the boy. But I went in and found these parchmented, hand-scripted poems, you know, like 50 of them that he had written. So I read through. I was like, oh my God, I knew Bobby was a poet. And I stole the poems. I stole the whole thing. She didn't care. But then when I went to college, my first semester of college took a class in contemporary poetry, and it was, you know, it was the feast. I read Merwin in that class. I read Gary Snyder in that class. I read Adrienne Rich, Robin Morgan, Phil Levine, Michael Harper. You know, the list went on, and it was, and that was like a gate for me, that generation of poets. And so then I began to read Galway Canaletto. It took me a while to move. That was such a big generation. So I was just in love with what it was, and they were alive, and then I began to work my way, and that was, you know, one of the great things about the poets of ayer, or ayer, is that they're not really, right? So, you know, I feel that I'm still always encountering a new poet and in some kind of conversation with them. I mean, I think I am always thinking as much about who I'm speaking with back in time as I am who I'm speaking with in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
Two quick responses to that. One is I really try to allow myself in the walking around in the world to see things and mumble sentences to myself. So I try to mumble sentences and then mess around with those sentences. Just play with syntax. Just try to see if something will spark up. And if something sparks up, you know, then I'm the person standing at the street corner writing it down. So I kind of do that as a little bit of my walking through the world practice. And the second piece is fortunate or unfortunate. The bulk of my writing life has happened once I had children. And so the waiting for inspiration was just an impossibility. I live a pretty boringly disciplined life. So I try to sit at a desk pretty regularly, trying to make something show up. And it works. You know, sometimes it's a lot of garbage that shows up, but sometimes something sticks to the page.